Let me tell you something I noticed this morning while I was having my coffee. I looked out the window and the leaves were perfectly still, not a breath of wind. And it occurred to me that sometimes in nature, the most dangerous moments come when everything seems calm on the surface. No warnings, no sirens, just an eerie stillness that hides what's building on the horizon. Now I want to talk to you today about something similar happening in the world of money, something that has been quietly, almost invisibly, eating away at the financial security of millions of Americans, and nobody seems to want to talk about it directly. That something is the silent war being waged against your savings. I have spent decades studying how money works, how empires rise and fall, and how the decisions made in marble hallways by people in expensive suits eventually trickle down to affect the coffee you buy, the gas you pump, and the retirement you're dreaming about. And what I'm seeing now reminds me of something my father used to say. He would say, "Son, when the tide goes out, that's when you find out who was swimming naked." Right now, the tide is going out in many ways, and we are about to see some uncomfortable sights. But more importantly, we are about to see why the most important conversation nobody is having is about the future of your savings. Now, here's what I want you to understand before we go any further. This is not about politics. This is not about pointing fingers at any particular person or party. This is about arithmetic. And arithmetic doesn't care about your feelings or your ideology. 2 plus 2 equals 4 whether you voted for the person in charge or not. So let's talk about the numbers, because the numbers are telling a story that the headlines are carefully avoiding. Think about what happened to your savings in the last few years. You put money in the bank, the same bank your parents used, the same bank that your grandfather trusted with his life savings. And what did you get? Maybe 1% interest, maybe less. But meanwhile, the things you buy every single day started costing more. Milk went up, gas went up. The price of everything from a dozen eggs to a used car shot upward like a rocket, and the interest you were earning on your savings. It crawled along like a snail, barely keeping pace with the rate at which your purchasing power was evaporating. Here is the kitchen table calculation I want you to do right now. Let's say you had $50,000 saved, the kind of money that represents years of hard work and careful spending. You put it in a savings account that paid you 1% interest per year. That gave you $500 in a whole year of work. But during that same year, inflation ran at 5%. That means the $50,000 you had, in terms of what it could actually buy, shrank to be worth $47,500 in real terms. You earned $500 but lost $2,500. That is a net loss of $2,000 simply for doing the responsible thing, for saving money instead of spending it. Now, if that doesn't make your blood run cold, I don't know what will. And I want you to remember that number, $2,000, because that is what the system is taking from responsible savers like you. Now here is the part that really bugs me. I have been in rooms, I have read reports, I have studied history for most of my life, and I can tell you that the people making the decisions understand exactly what is happening. They understand that when you flood the system with money, when you print currency like there's no tomorrow, something has to give. Prices have to rise. The value of existing money has to fall. It's not magic, it's mathematics. And yet somehow the message that gets broadcast to everyday people is always the same. Don't worry, inflation is transitory. Everything is fine. Keep saving, keep working, keep trusting the system. But the people who are closest to the system, the ones who actually control the spigots, they don't seem to be following their own advice. Let me explain it this way. Imagine you have a bathtub, and in this bathtub you have a certain amount of water. That water represents the total value of everything in the economy, all the goods and services, all the houses and cars and everything else. Now the government comes along and starts pouring more water into the tub, but the tub is the same size. So what happens? The water level rises, which sounds good on the surface. But here is the thing, every time they pour in new water, the existing water gets diluted. So if you had a cup of water representing your savings, your cup is still the same size, but the water in it now represents a smaller portion of the total tub. That is inflation in its simplest form. And right now, there are a lot of people with pitchers, pouring more and more water into that tub, and they are doing it for reasons that seem logical to them. But the consequences fall on people like you and me who are just trying to keep our cup full. Now, if you are the type of person who prefers a calm strategy over a panicked headline, you will find that in the Calm Money Playbook. It is written for people who like to read and think, rather than shout and react. And the playbook addresses exactly this situation, because the solution is not to run around like a chicken with your head cut off. The solution is to understand the game and play it smarter than everybody else. All right, let's dig a little deeper. You have probably heard the term central bank before. Maybe you know that the Federal Reserve is our central bank and that there are central banks in other countries too. What you may not know is how much power these institutions actually have over your daily life. A central bank is essentially the bank for banks. It sets the interest rates that determine how much it costs to borrow money, and it controls the supply of money in the economy. When a central bank decides to lower interest rates, borrowing becomes cheaper, which encourages people and businesses to take on more debt. That sounds good for a while, but it also means that people are spending borrowed money, and when people spend borrowed money, they bid up prices. When prices go up, the central bank often raises interest rates again to cool things down. This is the dance that has been going on for decades, and most people don't even realize they are part of the choreography. Now here is what is interesting. When the system gets into trouble, and I mean really into trouble, what do the decision makers typically do? They lower interest rates and they print more money. Why? Because it is the easiest, most politically palatable solution. Nobody wants to be the person who stands up and says, hey, we made some mistakes and now we have to suffer through some difficult times. Instead, the easier path is to kick the can down the road, to print more money, to keep interest rates low, to stimulate the economy, to make it look like things are getting better even if the underlying problems are just getting bigger. Now I want to talk about something that Charlie Munger, one of the wisest men I ever knew, used to say all the time. He would say, show me the incentive and I will show you the outcome. That is such an important principle, and once you understand it, you start to see the world in a completely different way. So who has the incentive to keep the system running the way it has been running? Well, first, there are the governments. Governments all over the world have accumulated massive amounts of debt. The United States alone has debts that are measured in the tens of trillions of dollars. And when you owe a lot of money, there is one thing you want above all else, and that is for interest rates to stay low. Because every point that interest rates rise means that your debt servicing costs go up, and suddenly you have less money to spend on the things that politicians want to spend money on. So governments have a powerful incentive to keep interest rates low for as long as possible, even if that means inflation stays higher than it should. Then there are the banks. Banks love low interest rates too, for a different reason. When interest rates are low, people borrow more. And when people borrow more, banks make more money on the spread between what they pay depositors and what they charge borrowers. So banks have an incentive to support policies that keep interest rates low. And then there are the politicians, who want the economy to look good during their term so they can get re-elected. A low interest rate environment tends to stimulate economic activity, which makes the unemployment rate look good, which makes the stock market look good, which makes people feel wealthier, which makes them more likely to vote for the incumbent. So everyone who is making decisions has an incentive to keep the party going, to keep rates low, to keep printing money, even though the eventual consequences of those decisions are going to fall on people who have no say in the matter, like you and me and our neighbors. Now, here is the uncomfortable truth. The people who are making these decisions are not evil. Most of them are just trying to do what they think is best, given the incentives they face. But the problem is that they are making decisions with somebody else's money. And I learned a long time ago that when you spend someone else's money, you are a lot less careful than when you spend your own. That is why I have always been such a strong advocate for personal responsibility and personal savings. Because when you are spending your own money, when you are living within your own means, you have a natural check on excess. But when the system is spending money that doesn't belong to it, when it is borrowing from future generations without their consent, that check disappears. And what you get is a gradual, almost imperceptible erosion of the value of money, which is another way of saying a gradual, almost imperceptible theft from people who did everything right. And this brings us to the heart of the matter. The silent war against savings is not a conspiracy. It is not some secret plot hatched in a shadowy room. It is simply the natural outcome of a system where the people who control the money supply face incentives to keep money flowing, regardless of the long-term consequences. And the people who suffer are the ones who did what they were told, who saved their money, who lived below their means, who planned for the future. They are being punished for being responsible, and that is something that really grinds my gears. Let's do another kitchen table calculation, because I think these help to ground the abstract in the concrete. Let's say you are a retired couple, and you have saved $300,000 for your retirement. You are living on the interest, because you have been taught your whole life that you should not touch the principal. You want to leave something to your kids, and you want to make sure you don't outlive your money. Now, if inflation runs at 4% per year, which is a reasonable assumption given where we have been, your $300,000 in purchasing power will be cut in half in about 18 years. You are not spending the money. You are not taking any risks. You are just leaving it in the bank, and yet your real purchasing power is cut in half every 18 years. Now, if you are 65 years old, that means by the time you are 83, the money you worked a lifetime to save will only buy half as much as it did when you retired. That is not a hypothetical scenario. That is arithmetic. And it is happening right now to millions of retirees who have done nothing wrong except trust the system that was supposed to protect them. Now, here is the other thing nobody is talking about: energy costs. Now, I know that sounds like a technical term, and I apologize for that. Let me translate it into something you can feel. Energy is just another way of saying the power to do things. It is the gas in your car, the electricity that runs your refrigerator, the natural gas that heats your home in the winter. And here is what happens when energy costs go up. Every single thing that gets made, every single thing that gets transported, every single thing that gets sold in a store requires energy somewhere along the way. The farmer uses diesel to run his tractor. The factory uses electricity to run its machines. The truck driver uses gas to deliver the products. The store uses electricity to keep the lights on and the refrigeration running. So when energy costs go up, they don't just go up in one place. They ripple through the entire supply chain like waves. And by the time those waves reach you at the kitchen table, they show up as higher prices on everything you buy. Think about a loaf of bread. What does it take to make a loaf of bread? First, you need wheat, which requires farming, which requires fuel for tractors and trucks to haul the grain. Then you need a mill to grind the wheat into flour, which requires electricity and maybe natural gas. Then you need a bakery to turn the flour into bread, which requires more energy for ovens and mixing machines. Then you need packaging, which requires plastic, which requires oil, which requires energy. Then you need transportation, which requires diesel fuel. Then you need the store to keep the lights on, which requires electricity. So when the price of energy goes up at any point in that chain, the price of bread eventually goes up too. And the same thing is true for everything else you buy, from the clothes on your back to the phone in your pocket. Energy is the blood that flows through the veins of the economy, and when it gets more expensive, everything gets more expensive. And this is why I have always said that energy policy is one of the most important issues that nobody is paying enough attention to. Now let me talk about scenarios. I'm not a fortune teller, and I don't pretend to know exactly what is going to happen. But I do know that there are different paths the future can take, and it is important to understand the range of possibilities so that you can prepare for all of them. This is something I have always believed, and it comes straight from my principles. Expect the best, plan for the worst, and understand that the most likely outcome is somewhere in between. The first scenario is the best case. In this scenario, the central banks around the world manage to get inflation under control without causing a severe recession. Interest rates come down gradually, the economy keeps growing, and people who have saved money start to see their savings grow in real terms again. In this scenario, if you have cash set aside, you might be able to invest it in something that earns a decent return without taking too much risk. This is the scenario where patience is rewarded, and the people who kept their cool during the storm come out ahead. The second scenario, and I think this is the one we are most likely to see, is what I call the frozen conflict or the slow drain. In this scenario, inflation stays elevated, central banks keep interest rates higher than we would like, and the economy muddles along with neither booms nor busts. In this scenario, if you have your money sitting in a savings account earning 1% while inflation runs at 3 or 4%, you are slowly losing ground. Not in a dramatic crash kind of way, but in a quiet, steady erosion kind of way. This is the scenario where having the right strategy really matters, because if you just let your money sit passively, you will slowly be drained, like water seeping out of a cracked bucket. The third scenario is the one nobody wants to think about, but we have to be honest about. That is the full escalation scenario, where things get out of control and we see a more severe economic adjustment. I am not predicting this. I am just saying it is one of the possibilities, and if you are prepared for it, you will be in a better position than if you were blindsided by it. In this scenario, you want to have some liquidity, some cash or near-cash assets that you can access quickly without having to sell things at the worst possible time. And you want to avoid being overextended, which means no more debt than you can comfortably handle even if things get tough. Now, regardless of which scenario plays out, there are some things that are always true, and these are the things I want you to focus on because they are within your circle of control. Nobody can control what the Federal Reserve does. Nobody can control what the government does with its spending or its money printing. Nobody can control the geopolitical situation halfway around the world. But everybody can control their own savings strategy, their own spending habits, and their own mindset. So what does the calm money playbook look like in practice? First, it means having cash reserves that are large enough to cover at least 6 months of expenses, and more is better. This is your buffer, your cushion, your emergency fund. It is the thing that lets you sleep at night when the world is going crazy around you. Second, it means being very careful about taking on new debt, especially long-term debt like a 30-year mortgage. Because when you take on debt, you are making a bet that the future will be better than the present, that your income will go up, that interest rates will stay low, that the value of whatever you are buying will increase. Those are not always safe bets. Third, it means diversifying your savings so that you are not completely dependent on any one asset class or any one currency. History has shown that the people who spread their bets tend to do better over the long run than the people who put everything in one place. Now I want to come back to something I said earlier about incentives. If you look at the people who have accumulated the most wealth in our society, you will notice something interesting. Most of them are not sitting on large piles of cash earning minimal interest. Most of them have their money working in some form, whether it is in businesses or real estate or stocks or other assets that have the potential to grow over time. They understand that cash is a place to hide, but it is not a place to grow. So if you have been keeping all of your savings in cash because you are afraid of risk, I understand that impulse, and it is not entirely wrong. But at the same time, you need to understand that the risk of keeping everything in cash is that your purchasing power slowly shrinks over time. So the goal is not to have all cash or no cash. The goal is to find the right balance for your specific situation, your specific risk tolerance, your specific time horizon. And that is really the key insight. There is no one-size-fits-all solution. What is right for you depends on your age, your health, your family situation, your income, your expenses, your goals, your fears. And that is why I have always believed that the most important financial decision you can make is to educate yourself, to understand how the system works, and to make your own decisions based on your own circumstances rather than just following the herd. Because the herd, more often than not, ends up at the cliff at the same time, and the people who win are the ones who think independently and act with patience and discipline. Now let me give you one more thing to think about. When I look at the history of money, when I look at what has happened to currencies and economies over the centuries, I see a pattern. And that pattern is that debts eventually have to be paid one way or another. Either you pay them down through discipline and austerity, or you pay them down through inflation, which is a stealth tax, or you pay them down through default, which is the ugly option that nobody wants to talk about. Each of these paths has different winners and losers. In a world of inflation, the winners are borrowers and the losers are savers. In a world of austerity, the winners are savers and the losers are borrowers. In a world of default, everybody loses in different ways, but some people lose more than others. The question is not whether you can avoid these realities. The question is whether you can position yourself to be on the right side of them. And that is where the calm money playbook comes in again. It is not about predicting exactly what is going to happen. It is about building a strategy that works in all scenarios, that gives you flexibility, that keeps you from being forced into bad decisions by circumstances beyond your control. Because the worst thing you can do is to be in a position where you have to sell something at the worst possible time just because you need the money. That is the hallmark of poor planning, and it is what separates the people who survive difficult times from the people who get crushed by them. So here is my ask of you. Don't panic. Don't ignore the problem either. Look at your situation honestly. Figure out how much you have saved, how much you are spending, what your income is, what your debts are. Think about what could go wrong and think about what you would do if it did. Build your buffer, be careful with new debt, and look for opportunities to put your money to work in a way that is consistent with your values and your risk tolerance. And one more thing, and I really want you to hear this. The most valuable asset you have is not your money. It is your time. The time you spend worrying about things you cannot control is time stolen from things you can control. So use your time wisely. Spend it with your family, do work that matters to you, read books that make you smarter, and build a life that is about more than just numbers on a screen. Because at the end of the day, money is just a tool. It is a way of storing value and exchanging value over time. But the value that really matters, the value that cannot be inflation adjusted or interest rate adjusted or any other way of adjusting, that is the value of a life well lived, of relationships that sustain you, of experiences that enrich you, of character that you can be proud of. Now, I know I have thrown a lot at you in this conversation, and I know that some of it might have been uncomfortable to hear. But I would rather you hear the truth and have to deal with it than hear comfortable lies and be blindsided by reality. Because the truth is that the world is more complex than the headlines suggest, that the decisions being made by powerful people have real consequences for ordinary people like you, and that your best defense is knowledge, patience, and a well-thought-out plan. So go forth and be wise with your money. Build your buffer, protect what you have earned, and above all, stay calm. Because in a world that rewards panic and punishes patience, the calm ones are the ones who come out ahead in the end. That is the way I have always approached money, and it is the way I encourage you to approach it too. The tide will go out eventually, and we will see who was swimming naked. But if you are dressed for the occasion, if you have your own flotation device, if you have built your own boat, you will be just fine. Now I want to leave you with one last thought. I have been doing this for a very long time. I have seen booms and busts, up markets and down markets, good times and bad times. And if there is one thing I have learned, it is that the people who do well over the long run are the ones who never lose sight of the basics. They save more than they spend. They invest in things they understand. They avoid getting caught up in the excitement of the moment. They think in terms of decades, not days. And they always have a plan B, a backup, a buffer, something that gives them options when things don't go as expected. That is the calm money approach. That is the approach that has worked for generations of wise people, and it is the approach that will work for you too. So take what you have learned here today, go home, sit down at your kitchen table, and start making your own plan. Because the future is not something that happens to you. It is something you create, one decision at a time. And the best decision you can make right now is to take control of your financial destiny with patience, wisdom, and discipline. That is my message for today. I hope it has been helpful. And remember, the Calm Money Playbook is there for you whenever you are ready for the next step. Take care and be well.